Hair and Now, the podcast about the mind-blowing science of hair growth, where biology, cutting-edge research, and the human experience collide to foster conversations about our follicles. Join host and Nutrafol co-founder Roland Peralta as he explores the amazing intersection of hair and health with doctors, scientists, hair health experts, and special guests. Now, here's Roland with Hair and Now.
On this podcast, we're going to talk about all things related to hair science and all the wonderful science behind hair health, hair growth, hair loss. We will introduce mind-blowing science concepts to you on this show in a fun, entertaining manner. Today's podcast will focus on bringing you back to school to Stress 101, how stress messes with your tresses. We'll discuss all the things related to stress and how they impact hair growth. Before we get started, I'd like to share our hair-raising tidbit of the day. It's a fact that low or high cortisol, the stress hormone, can lead to thyroid hormone downregulation. That, of course, can lead to poor hair growth cycling and inevitably hair loss. With me today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sophie Kogan and Dr. Melissa Anzelone. Sophie Kogan is the Chief Medical Officer at Nutrafol. Dr. Melissa Anzelone, a naturopathic doctor, is a member of our in-house science research team. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you so much.
So I know that we all probably have a story about stress and how that's impacted our lives, how that's impacted our hair growth. Sophie, I know that you have a great story in how that impacted your life starting in medical school, I think, right?
Well, actually, Roland, it started earlier. It started in college. So I am one of those people who is genetically predisposed to hair loss. But we know that genes don't necessarily mean that you'll have hair loss or when you'll have hair loss. It's the environment, like factors such as stress, that can really bring that out. So in my family, my dad's side, everybody kind of got bald pretty early, and I started thinning after I had a bout with an eating disorder in high school, and then that kind of triggered that
in itself right could trigger
off
hair
the
loss.
bat. So when we think of stress, we often think it's just psychological, but it's actually everything, whether it's a nutritional deficiency, such as when you have a problem with getting enough nutrients during, when one is battling a eating disorder. Of course, that brings its own psychological aspects to it. Whether it's toxins, whether it's foods we eat that have a lot of chemicals, or processed food that are stressing the gut. So stress can be in many different ways. It can really encompass a variety of different triggers. And so for me, that started out with the eating disorder, but then during medical school, or during college and during medical school, and then during residency, and then during another residency, I had stepwise shedding and hair loss. So I know, looking back now, that those times have been during excessive times of stress, and then it would kind of go back to normal and never go back to complete normal. But so that was really my journey with stress and hair. I know that now, looking back after everything that I do know today, is that most likely I was really basically in adrenal fatigue, or on my way to it. We call that a syndrome of the 21st century today, where a lot of people are so stressed that their cortisol levels are really dysregulated. Like you said, sometimes they're high, sometimes they're low, sometimes they're high and low at an appropriate time. So all of that is adrenal dysfunction or adrenal fatigue, which is kind of in itself talks about just the adrenal glands that are sitting on top of our kidneys. But in reality, those glands have such an important function in our bodies, that this sort of maladaptation to the stress response causes a lot of different dysfunctions in the body. That ultimately, one of them is definitely hair loss.
Yes. It's interesting as you're sharing your story. I also lived a very stressful life for a number of years, and I eventually was diagnosed as hypothyroid, and but I didn't quite take medication, the thyroid hormone. A year after I was diagnosed as being hypothyroid, I was actually diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And that was quite stressful, living with the idea that I've got cancer. So post thyroid, I had a thyroidectomy, and post surgery, it activated what looked like a predisposition to hair loss. My hair started falling out, and I attributed it to the surgery. Surgery is a physical stressor that causes stress on the body, and that obviously elevates cortisol, which leads to inflammation, which leads to hair loss. It changes the hair growth cycling, right? So, so post surgery, I began experiencing what looked like androgenic alopecia. So clearly, I wasn't quite aware that I was predisposed to, even though my entire family was balding. It looked like I had not escaped the bad gene, and consequently started losing my hair, and of course here we are.
Roland, speaking of thyroid hormone and stress, when we have that increase in stress hormone, we can actually see a downregulation of TSH, which is the hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, that actually downregulates the production of our thyroid hormone. Because we see that decrease, we're seeing a decrease in our metabolism or the absorption in our gut, and then we're actually not absorbing the proteins and the minerals needed to construct hair.
Interesting. But is it true that you could have elevated TSH and yet have T4, T3 in the normal range?
Definitely.
That's like a typical, that's still a warning. It should be a red flag for anybody looking at blood values when
Could
they're
be
trying
a
to
red
diagnose
flag.
you with.
Definitely. And really, the increase in reverse T3 is another sign. A lot of times people will talk to, us in the office. Customers will call and say, okay, my thyroid is fine, but my hair is still falling out. Everything else is fine. What's wrong with me? And there is such a thing as subclinical hypothyroidism or thyroid disease that is not detectable by lab work, but that elevated cortisol still has a profound effect on those thyroid hormones, and again can go down that pathway. Decreased metabolism, decreased absorption of both the proteins and the nutrients needed to build the hair. And not only are we not getting the proteins and the nutrients to build the hair, but we're also decreasing the selenium and the iodine that's really absorbed through the diet. Both of these things are essential for creating thyroid hormone, whether it's the conversion of the active form or inactive form to the active form, or in actually creating the thyroid hormone itself.
Interesting. So how does stress then compromise thyroid hormone production? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, first I want to comment on one of the things that you both mentioned, which is that the TSH is actually the one thing that we look for in Western medicine as an indicator of whether or not somebody has a thyroid problem or hypothyroidism, because there's like a checks and balances sort of system in the body where if we have enough of the active T3 hormone, T4, then with T4 we'll go back and suppress production of thyroid stimulating hormone, which is what we test for. And if we don't have enough, then it goes up. So if it's elevated, there's definitely an issue. If it's not elevated, often enough, like Melissa said, patients are told that it's normal. So everything is fine. We have to look at other causes of hair loss. So thyroid hormones is one of the first things that Western doctors will test for. But very frequently, people will say, I have all the symptoms of a thyroid problem, like I did for most of my life.
But yet you were normal.
But yet every single time I tested it, it was always normal. So one of the things that's different about Western and Eastern medicine is that in Western medicine, when we test the blood or we test blood work, we have what we know are a range of normal values. So we know that somebody, we have an average of a variety of different people, right?
Whether you're 100 pounds or 300 pounds.
Exactly.
Right.
So that range is going to be that sort of normal window of where if you're suddenly 1 over or 0.1 over, then you're high. And if you're 0.1 under, then you're low. But within that range, you're considered normal.
Right.
But
So low normal, sadly, is construed as you're okay.
You're okay.
Right. But
You're
that's
still
not necessarily
okay.
the case.
Right, but if you think about this logically, first of all of us are varied and different, and what's your normal might not at all be my normal. And again, that takes this is just an average of hundreds and thousands of people. And then the other thing is that obviously those in-betweens are not considered, whereas maybe you're approaching that value that should have been that is not normal, but you're still considered normal. So you're dismissed in a sense, as saying that everything is okay. And one way around that is to go a step deeper and test for many other things. For instance, you talked about some of the reverse T3, which is a hormone that's produced that's not active.
Right.
When there's too much stress, or cortisol hormone, which is the stress hormone that our adrenal glands produce as a response to stress, to adapt to stress. And of course, that's a good thing. We evolved to do that because we need to run away from a bus or a train or something, or a lion or a tiger back in the caves, right? So it's very good. It's a good response, but the problem today is that we're overproducing that response. So the body doesn't know the difference between a life-threatening event and a non-life-threatening event. Right. So what it does, it'll mount the same type of response in an attempt to adapt to a stressor that could be innocuous. Like, for instance, somebody, like your boss yelling at you. Well, you don't have a boss. but if you were a bad boss and you were yelling, let's say, it's not a life-threatening event, right? You're not going to be killed by your boss, hopefully. But your body doesn't know the difference, so it's going to mount that response in the same way that you would have done to you running away from a lion or a tiger back in the day, because the body evolved that way. And when you have lots of these little things that add up over time, on a daily basis, and it could just be as simple as you being constantly connected to the phone and not being able to put it down, because it assumes that your body is in a constant state of arousal, in a constant state of stimulation. You're constantly being overstimulated, and that's really the problem today, is that we're constantly being overstimulated. The traffic, the bosses, the kids, and all of that adds up. And so this sort of stress response is in a constant go. And that's where the cortisol becomes dysregulated and is either initially overproduced, and eventually it could even be like underproduced after a certain period of time, when your body gets exhausted to constantly trying to adapt.
Right. Yeah. So
back to our question, right?
So no, what I wanted to say is that 50 million women in America are complaining of hair loss. 21st century living, hypothyroidism is an epidemic. There are millions of women, particularly, that are reporting hypothyroidism. Hypothyroidism, correct. And what is the connection to stress? Why are so many women losing their hair? Why are so many women suffering from hypothyroidism in 21st century modern day living?
Well, first, for our listeners, I want to connect those two to hair. So in terms of hair loss or hair shedding, the follicles are very, very sensitive to stress and to stress hormones, because they're not essential. So as much as we love our hair, the body...
Hair is not essential.
Yeah, right. So the body is not...
There are a lot of women who would disagree with that.
Absolutely, and I would probably disagree with it, but my body does not feel it's an essential organ for survival.
The evolutionary system, right.
So basically what we need for survival is, especially in a time of fight or flight, and when you're really hyperactive, you need to pump the blood, you need to the muscles, and take it away from the skin and the extra organs. So basically, make sure that you have enough to bring oxygen to the brain and to the muscles, so that you can really run away. Even your digestion could suffer as a result of an extensive stressor. So that, and of course, hair is just the last thing that you're going to think about. Your reproductive organs get shut down. Your hair gets sort of deprioritized, and nails too as well. All those things that are not necessary for survival, and so the body prioritizes other organs. And on a physiological level, the follicles are very sensitive to that stress hormone because they have their own receptors for the stress hormone and can actually
cortisol receptors.
Yes, and it can produce its own stress hormone as a result. So that's a kind of an unusual thing that we found only recently in research. But basically, there's a whole system of stress response in your skin, which is why psoriasis gets worse with stress, eczema gets worse with stress. So all of these, and so does hair loss, gets worse with stress because these are because we have nerve endings in our skin, we have hormone receptors in our skin, and we can actually modulate the stress response in the skin on its locally as well as systemically. Now, to your question of the 21st century, women are likely, as much as on the outside, I think, and I don't know if I'm going to say this right now, I think we're much better at handling stress. Handling it like as in not really
internalizing it, almost
intellectually,
pushing it in,
intellectually, yes, emotionally,
intelligence.
So women are good at multitasking, and so we've learned how to handle that on the outside, but that just means that we're internalizing a lot of it. So on a physical level, the body in women are likely, just evolutionary wise, we're not as our bodies are not apt to deal with all of this constant chronic stimulation and constant chronic stress. So
an elevation of that cortisol, because we're used to having those little spurts, right, that can save our lives or get us out of a bad situation. But when we see that cortisol constantly elevated, we're getting that suppression of thyroid hormone. We're getting that overcompensation of the adrenal glands to keep up with that demand. How many people have stayed up late and worked on something for work, until 2 a.m. When you do that, your stress hormone goes up, thyroid production goes down, hair production goes down, because just like you were saying, Dr. Kogan, hair is dead last on the list of priorities for the body. It's, and thank God, I want my body to prioritize my heart over my hair any day. But, however, pause.
No, there are people who may disagree with you.
Right. However, we flip that around. We want the hair to be number one again. So in order for it to be number one, we got to take care of everything else first. Right. We got to regulate everything else.
That's actually a good point.
Yeah.
And so the body can reprioritize that hair, put it number one, so we can feel good about ourselves.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and overall, I think if you look at how many women are losing hair today, also how many women are having symptoms of hypothyroidism, subclinical hypothyroidism, and frank hypothyroidism, or any other thyroid, hyper or hypo, thyroid dysregulation, as well as autoimmune disorders. So all of these really are manifestation, so to speak, of a maladapted stress response. So that our body is consistently attempting to mount a response, to adapt to a new stressor. And these stressors are numerous in our lives today. Like I said, physical as well as biological, as well as environmental and nutritional, and then psycho-emotional. Put that all together, that's a lot to handle. And as our bodies try to adapt on a regular basis, all of these other systems are getting compromised as a result of an adrenal dysfunction.
Exactly.
And so when one thing that I think is interesting is that when you do go to the doctor with a problem that is related to, for instance, thyroid, in Western medicine, we go straight for thyroid hormone. Right.
So immediately I write your prescription, you're hypothyroid, let me write you 100 micrograms of levothyroxine, and you should be fine.
Whereas
that's Western medicine. Naturopathy is completely different.
And when you look at that systems-wide, approach, what's the first thing that you, and I guess I have to ask you that question. I think one of the things that I understand and know that if you are, from an integrative perspective, if you come with a thyroid issue, that's not the first thing that you do. Exactly. The first thing that you want to do is really go back to the adrenal glands.
Yeah, you really want to treat the adrenals and support them 100% because they're really the cause of this entire thing.
And not the kids, the 6 kids running around the house driving you bat crazy.
Definitely, they're definitely up there.
Can't take away the kids. Got to do something with the adrenals.
Kids, deadlines, anything that drives us crazy is going to, increase that stress hormone, and really that's the cause of that decreased thyroid production. So, clinically, in my experience, treating the adrenals first only has a positive effect on the thyroid, and you're really treating the root cause, right? You're not saying, okay, thyroid, you're suppressed, but forget about you, adrenals. You're saying, okay, I'm going to address this root cause. I'm going to support the adrenals here so that the thyroid can basically fix itself.
Right, interesting. So I was just thinking about how I think that over the last 35, 40 years, I don't think I've ever been tested for cortisol hormone by any Western physician.
Right.
First time I tested for my cortisol hormones was I bought a kit on Amazon from ZRT, I think it was. And it was a saliva test, and it was maybe $90. And I got my kit, spat in a little tube, sent it to a lab, and 2 weeks later, I got my results back, and holy stressor. My stress levels were off the charts.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, that put everything in perspective. I thought I had everything under control, that I was managing my stress levels well, and clearly I was internalizing those stress levels. Is that something that you recommend to people? If you start looking at almost becoming an advocate for your own well-being, do you recommend that people spend $90 on a saliva cortisol test?
I would say definitely yes, because the saliva cortisol test can tell you the diurnal rhythm, which is basically the curve, the peaks and the valleys that kind of occur throughout the day. And that's really important when we're talking about adrenal health, because cortisol should peak in the morning, should be the highest around 4 or 5 a.m. Then it should dip around 2 or 3, and then it should decrease to put us to bed right before 11 p.m.
Right.
So I'm sure everyone's experienced, if you stay up past 11 p.m., you get that second wind, so that's that cortisol re-spiking. And what we can see, is really the 3 phases of adrenal problems. So first you have the alarm phase. So this is basically the adrenals reacting to excessive stress, really pumping out that cortisol like crazy. So you would see an elevated rhythm, kind of no matter what time of the day you were looking at. And then there's the resistance phase. So this is where the receptors in the body and the hair become less sensitive to stress hormone. So we could see either high or low rhythms at this point. And then there's the last phase, the exhaustion phase, where the adrenal gland says, forget you. You're going to stress me out all the time? I'm done. I'm just going to give up. So then we don't really produce any stress hormone. And this you can see a curve that's just completely below normal. So either one of those is bad. The last 2 are the worst. The way that affects hair is if your hormone is basically elevated or low, we're getting that, obviously, suppression of the thyroid hormone, which is decreasing the hair growth cycle, or the growth cycle, the anagen phase, or disrupting metabolism as a whole.
Right, interesting.
Yeah.
So Melissa, to your point, we know that thyroid hormone, particularly the T3 hormone, which is the active form of the thyroid hormone, is also known as the beauty hormone, plays a critical role in hair growth cycling.
Sure.
Let's briefly talk about how stress actually triggers hair loss, because in most cases, Western medicine talks about it anecdotally. I remember the first time I made a phone call to a physician introducing Nutrafol, and I mentioned the fact that one of the ingredients was targeting elevated cortisol. The response was, I was basically stopped in my tracks, and I was asked, well, what does elevated cortisol have anything to do with hair loss?
Oh.
So that was the light went off, and I realized this is about education. We need to now get our ducks in a row and present data and facts to the medical community to help support our findings and our research. So what exactly is happening at the follicle level? Why does stress actually cause hair to fall out?
Well, there's two ways. Like you said, one way I think we discussed, at least in part, and that is the overall effect of having elevated cortisol or dysregulated cortisol. Let's call it that. Per Melissa's description of this sort of stepwise decline in adapting to the stress response. But so there's a systems-wide compromise, and as a result, the mini organ that follicle is, it's not living outside of the system. So it clearly gets affected by the system through things like thyroid hormones or dysregulation of other hormones, because when we think about what happens again when you're stressed, is that another signal that goes down is that there's suppression of reproductive organs. Mm-hmm. And so progesterone, estrogen, and other hormones are compromised, and so there's a systems-wide response. When we talk about what happens to the follicle in itself, well, there are a couple of things. So one, I kind of mentioned, which is the fact that follicles have receptors for the cortisol hormone and other stress hormones that are made in the body. They almost have a replica of how to produce the hormone itself for themselves. So it is said that in a way that could be somewhat modulating the stress response in the skin in themselves. So it's interesting to know that they are like little antennas in some way, like the hairs. I don't often think about the hairs on your head, but I also think about the hairs on your body and everywhere else and how they respond to stress. So there's a hormonal effect, and when cortisol is overproduced, it has a direct effect on
estrogen, for example. Estrogen dominance is
right.
a consequence of elevated
Well, I would call that a
cortisol.
systems-wide, but in terms of the follicle itself, it creates inflammation. So it triggers mast cell degranulation. Mast cells are one of the cells that are part of our immune system.
Yeah, well, thinking of that, Sophie, sorry to interrupt you. With your points, Roland, with the increase in cortisol, you're getting that decrease in pregnenolone, which is actually the precursor to all the sex hormones.
Yes.
Right? So we're seeing an increase in cortisol because it's stealing all that pregnenolone. Right. Then we're seeing a decrease in progesterone, increase in estrogen relative to that progesterone, and then that estrogen dominance picture where we're getting moodiness, more PMS, hair shedding, all sorts of different things.
Yeah. So that goes back to the story of the whole body and how it responds. Right. And at the follicle, there's this inflammatory component, and it also is a catagen inducer. So catagen is the regression phase of the follicle. And once you go to catagen, then you go to the telogen phase, which is the resting phase, and then the only path from there is exogen, which is hair loss. So when you have too much of the overproduction and too many of these inflammatory markers, it will actually throw the system into more hair shedding rather than hair growth. On another spectrum, we also have little tiny nerve endings in our skin. So the stress response is a combination of both metabolic, endocrine, and hormonal, endocrine and neurological as well. So there's the neurological, the neuroendocrine response as well. So when we have a stressor, the brain sends signals down and through the nerves as well, and those little nerves in the skin will produce other neuroimmunomodulatory molecules that will signal changes in the immune components surrounding that area, as well as send signals that are neurological. So one of those is substance P, and when that gets released, well, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Everything is good until it's too much of it. So it can also shift the hair cycle as well. as a result of higher stress levels. They've done studies in mice, for instance, and on hair follicles in petri dishes where they will stress the mice out. Unfortunately, I feel very bad for the mice, but they do stress them out, and usually through loud noises. And when that's chronic, they show what happens as a result of that. And there's all these changes, including the cortisol changes at the follicle itself, including the overproduction of these molecules like substance P that will also trigger an inflammatory reaction around the follicle and lead to apoptosis, which is cell death. So as a result of that, a lot more follicles will go into this shedding phase rather than the growth phase. And we see that quite frequently in people with what we know is a result of a sudden stressor like telogen effluvium. Telogen effluvium is a known stress-induced hair loss in Western medicine, but again, it's one of those things where, well, we know that that's caused by sudden stress, but sudden stress is not as much of an issue today as chronic stress. And so those people who suffer from telogen effluvium, often enough, they come back and they say, well, I had this period of excessive shedding, and usually it happens about 3 to 6 months after the event. So if you ask the patient, they either broke up with a boyfriend or a family death or maybe a surgery or even after birth, after childbirth, they'll suddenly have a lot of hair coming out. And often we tell people, okay, well, it's going to get better and it's going to resolve over time because that's just the body's response to prioritizing other organs during a highly stressful time. But often people come back and say that it doesn't go back to full.
There's no guarantee you're going to recover.
They don't recover fully a lot of times, or maybe they turn into a more chronic picture. And so that's where we understand that it's not that sudden stress that hits them. Maybe that was the initial factor, but it's really the underlying chronic level of stress that continues this progression and makes, inflammation begets inflammation, stress begets more stress, and so it kind of a chronic picture of over time.
So how do you manage stress-related hair loss? What I know that in Western medicine there's nothing we can do other than we recommend, you can recommend meditation, yoga, take a vacation, date night, leave the kids at home with the babysitter and have the kids torture someone else for $20 an hour. In naturopathy, it's a completely different understanding.
It's completely different because I think we're looking at it as a systemic approach. So adaptogens are an amazing remedy for stress-induced
Adaptogens are a
hair loss.
class of botanicals, plants that can lower elevated stress hormones.
Exactly. I like to think of them as like a stress vaccine because they actually make the body and the hair follicle less sensitive to stress hormone. So you're not getting that terrible cascade. You're not getting that, increase in cortisol, increase in inflammation, and then everything that begets that, right? Like Dr. Kogan was saying, your release of substance P, everything else. So with the adaptogen, and we've got a whole array of adaptogens in our toolbox.
Nutrafol uses ashwagandha.
Yep, ashwagandha is
standardized to 10% withanolides, which we know is clinically proven in an ingredient study to lower elevated cortisol in chronically stressed adults.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, we've had other components such as ginseng. There's other adaptogens that I've used clinically as well, but ashwagandha happens to be my favorite.
So, in conclusion, can we say that stress triggered hair loss can be potentially stabilized by the use of adaptogens, Dr. Kogan?
Yes, I think it's a number of things. You can't, I think a lot of us are looking for that magic bullet, that magic pill. It's not like you're going to take a stress adaptogen and it's going to function like Xanax. It's not like that. So we have to continue. It's a long process of maybe combining the stress adaptogen. In our supplement, we combine it with anti-inflammatories and hormone rebalances and other supportive elements that can support the thyroid and support the adrenal glands and counter the inflammation and hormonal imbalances. So I think that definitely the adaptogens are a wonderful tool, and it's helped tons of women as we know from our experience and bringing this even to Western medicine. Now that we go to conferences, there are a lot of doctors talking about stress adaptogens based on knowing their experience with our supplement and knowing that that's the one tool that they have now in their toolbox to help people with stress-related hair loss, whereas before we just didn't have anything at all.
Right.
And I think one of the things that I'd like to add to your description of the adaptogens is that they're, by definition, they are safe to use. So they're considered to be safe for in even larger quantities. That's kind of the way that that's what the name even implies, is that they're not only helping the body adapt, but also they're an adaptive herb, meaning that they can have an effect of a rebalancing effect rather than a direct effect, meaning that if your cortisol is too high, you're at that alarm stage of stress, it'll help you lower it. When your cortisol is low because your adrenals are not producing enough, it'll help the adrenals make more. And that's a concept that we're not used to in Western medicine, right? We're not used to the idea that these are very smart plants and they act in a different way because they can target many different receptors rather than just one single one like medications do. So I think that's a huge advantage of being able to use something that is safe, that is rebalancing and optimizing, and helping really get to the root of the problem rather than just a Band-Aid or a solution that's not going directly to the challenge. But in addition to that, I'm going to say that I do agree with doing all these other modifications as well. You have to consider the fact that taking an adaptogen is not going to be the only solution. You need to implement other lifestyle modifications, and of course,
not so easy sometimes.
It's terribly hard, but at the same time, it's getting a lot easier. It's getting a lot easier for us to do that. There's apps. There's the a Calm app. There's lots of. I don't get paid by them, so I'm just saying that there's Headspace. There's others. So there's little tools that we now have as a result of technology that could be helpful for people that are really busy. They don't necessarily maybe have to step out of their office to go and meditate or to go and find a yoga class. Maybe they can bring it into home and have those even tiny little moments during the day where they can focus in and really do a little breathing or do something else. It's something that can really help them optimize their stress adaptogenic routine, and also diet. Diet is a stressor as well. So all of these things in combination. So managing not just the cortisol, but also making sure that you don't ingest as many toxins or processed foods or chemicals that are stressing your gut, because all of these stressors play a role. So I think always lifestyle modifications together with supplementation is the way to go.
I had this visual of two doctors, a Western doctor holding a pink pill and a naturopath holding the blue pill. And the question is, which pill is it? Is it the chill pill or is it the stress adaptogen that you would take?
And then you're going to say, I'm going to meditate on it.
Fascinating. So terrific. So in conclusion, stress adaptogens play a major role in building resistance to stress and helping either lower elevated cortisol, the stress hormone, or helping increase the production should your cortisol function be producing lower than usual levels.
Exactly.
I love stress adaptogens. I think they are a miracle plant. Thank you very much. I think that was great.
Thank you.
Thank you
Dr.
so much.
Melissa. Thank you, Dr. Sophie. And that concludes our episode on Stress 101, Messes with Your Tresses. Feel free to find us on Nutrafol.com. Check out our bio, lots of great research articles on our blog at Nutrafol.com. And if you like what you're hearing, feel free to subscribe to our podcast at Apple iTunes or at our YouTube channel or on social media. Thank you very much. Until we meet again.
Thanks for listening to Hair and Now with host and Nutrafol co-founder Roland Peralta. See you next time.